York in 900 AD. A Viking city inside a Roman shell. Stand on the corner of Stonegate and High Petergate in the heart of York, and look carefully at what surrounds you. The street you are standing on follows a line that has existed for nearly 2,000 years. The name Stonegate preserves, in anglicized form, the Latin Via Praetoria, the stone street of the Roman fortress that occupied this ground from the 1st century AD. The medieval timber-framed buildings leaning over the narrow lane replaced earlier structures that replaced still earlier structures, going back through Viking occupation to the Roman legionary fortress of Eboracum, whose defensive walls still stand in places to their original height just a few hundred meters from where you are standing. York is one of the most historically layered cities in the British Isles, but of all the periods in its remarkable history, none is stranger, more dramatic, or less completely understood than the period when it was not York at all, when it was Jorvik, the capital of a Viking kingdom that controlled much of northern England for nearly a century. In the year 900 AD, the city that stood on this ground was a paradox. It was built inside the bones of a Roman legionary fortress. The walls, the street grid, the very geometry of the space defined by Roman military engineers 8 centuries earlier. But the people who lived inside those walls were Norse and Anglo-Scandinavian traders, warriors, craftsmen, and merchants who had come from Denmark and Norway and who had, in just a few decades, transformed a declining Anglo-Saxon settlement into one of the most commercially active cities in northern Europe. A Viking city inside a Roman shell. That is what York was in 900 AD, and the story of how it got there and what daily life inside it actually looked like is one of the most fascinating chapters in British history. Chapter 1: The city before the Vikings. WH80. They inherited. To understand York in 900 AD, you need to understand what the Vikings found when they arrived, because they did not build their city from nothing. They built it on top of something very old. The Romans established their legionary fortress at Eboracum in approximately 71 AD, during the advance of the 9th Legion into northern Britain. The site was chosen with Roman precision, a naturally defensible position on a peninsula of higher ground between the confluence of the River Ouse and the River Foss, two navigable waterways that provided both defensive protection and commercial access to the coast via the Humber estuary. The fortress of Eboracum was a standard playing card-shaped Roman legionary base, rectangular, with rounded corners, covering approximately 50 hectares, designed to house a full legion of approximately 5,000 soldiers. Its walls were initially of turf and timber, later rebuilt in stone, and its internal layout followed the rigid Roman military grid, the Via Principalis running across the center, the Via Praetoria running from the main gate to the Principia, the headquarters building at the fortress's heart. Those streets, those lines, are still present in York street plan today, fossilized into the medieval and modern city that grew over and around them. Eboracum became, in the 3rd and 4th centuries, one of the most important cities in Roman Britain. The Emperor Septimius Severus died here in 211 AD. The Emperor Constantius Chlorus died here in 306 AD, and it was in Eboracum that his son Constantine was first proclaimed emperor, the Constantine who would go on to found Constantinople and issue the Edict of Milan. For a brief period, Eboracum was the seat of an emperor of Rome, a fact that gives this corner of northern England a place in world history that its current modest scale does not suggest. After the Roman withdrawal from Britain in the early 5th century, Eboracum followed the trajectory of other Roman cities in the province: depopulation, partial abandonment, the accumulation of the dark earth layer over abandoned urban surfaces. The Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Northumbria eventually established itself in the region, and the city, now called Eoforwic in Old English, became the seat of an archbishop in 627 AD, when Paulinus baptized the Northumbrian king Edwin and established the first church on the site of what would eventually become York Minster. By the 8th century, Eoforwic was a center of Anglo-Saxon learning and ecclesiastical life. The scholar Alcuin, the most important intellectual figure of the Carolingian Renaissance, who became a key advisor to Charlemagne, was educated in the city's cathedral school and described it in his writings as a flourishing center of books and learning. That city, the Anglo-Saxon Eoforwic, is what the Vikings found when they arrived in 866 AD. Chapter 2, the Viking Conquest, and its immediate aftermath. The Viking capture of York in 866 AD was not a random raid. It was a deliberate military campaign of conquest. The Great Heathen Army, the name given by Anglo-Saxon chroniclers to the large Danish force that landed in England in 865 AD, was not a raiding party. It was an invading army, and its commanders understood the strategic value of controlling the most important city in northern England. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records the capture of York on November 1, 866 at All Saints' Day, when the Danish forces exploited divisions within the Northumbrian kingdom, whose rival kings Law and Osbert had temporarily set aside their conflict to attempt a recapture of the city in March 867 AD. The Northumbrian counter-attack failed, both kings were killed, and the Danish forces consolidated their control of the city and the surrounding region. The leaders of the Great Heathen Army are named in the sources. Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan Ragnarsson are the most prominently documented, though the precise historical details of their careers involve significant scholarly debate. What is not debated is the outcome. York became the capital of a Scandinavian kingdom in northern England, and it would remain under Scandinavian control, with one significant interruption until 954 AD, when the last Viking king of York, Eric Bloodaxe, was killed at the Battle of Stainmore. In the year 900 AD, the city was approximately 34 years into Scandinavian rule. The initial military occupation had given way to something more complex and more interesting: a settlement process in which Scandinavian newcomers interacted with, intermarried with, and gradually merged with the existing Anglo-Saxon population to produce a distinctive Anglo-Scandinavian culture that is visible in the archaeological record, in the linguistic record, and in the place names of the Yorkshire landscape. Chapter 3, the urban layout. Roman bones, Viking flesh. The most immediately striking fact about Jorvik in 900 AD, the fact that gives this video its title, is the relationship between the city's Viking inhabitants and the Roman infrastructure they occupied. The Roman fortress walls of Eboracum were still standing in 900 AD, not as complete, fully maintained military fortifications. 8 centuries of neglect, partial reuse, and material extraction had taken their toll, but as substantial stone structures that continued to define the city's outline and provide genuine defensive value. The Roman walls of York are still standing today, and while the current visible structure incorporates substantial medieval rebuilding and restoration, the foundations and lower courses at multiple points are genuinely Roman. The same stonework that Roman military engineers constructed in the 2nd and 3rd centuries add. The street grid of the Viking city followed the Roman street grid beneath it with remarkable fidelity, particularly within the area of the former legionary fortress north of the Ouse. The 2 main Roman streets, the Via Principalis, running roughly east to west, and the Via Praetoria, running roughly north to south, became the primary streets of Viking Jorvik, slightly modified in alignment and surface, but fundamentally continuous with their Roman predecessors. The modern streets of Petergate and Stonegate follow these Roman lines to south of the Ouse. In the area known as Micklegate, a name preserving the Old Norse words for Great Street, the civilian settlement that had grown up adjacent to the Roman fortress expanded significantly during the Viking period. This area became a major commercial zone, its streets dense with workshops, markets, and the riverside trading activity that was the economic engine of the city. The most extraordinary archaeological evidence for the Viking city comes from a single excavation site, Coppergate, in the heart of the modern city center. Excavations conducted by the York Archaeological Trust between 1976 and 1981 among the most significant urban archaeological investigations ever conducted in Britain revealed a sequence of Viking Age structures of remarkable preservation, their organic remains, timber, leather, bone, textile, and food residues preserved by the waterlogged soil conditions of the low-lying riverside location. The Coppergate excavations form the evidential foundation for almost everything we know about daily life in Viking York, and their findings are the basis for the Jorvik Viking Center that stands on the same site today. The street name Coppergate preserves Old Norse gata meaning street, and the copper element most likely referring to the cupmakers or coopers who worked there. Viking York named its streets for the crafts practiced on them, a naming convention that produced the remarkable survival of Old Norse street terminology in modern York: Gudramgate, Gillygate, Micklegate, Gudramgate, Feesgate, each name a linguistic fossil of the Scandinavian city that occupied this ground 11 centuries ago. Chapter for Architecture and Building Materials. The buildings of Viking Jorvik were, with the exception of the surviving Roman structures and the Minster complex, constructed primarily of timber, wattle, and daub, in such a complete contrast to the stone and brick construction of the Roman city whose bones they occupied. The Coppergate excavations revealed the physical remains of Viking-age buildings in extraordinary detail. The structures uncovered were rectangular timber-framed buildings, their walls constructed of upright posts with woven wattle panels filled with daub, a mixture of clay, dung, and chopped straw. The floors were of compacted earth, or in some cases, wooden planking. The roofs were almost certainly thatched. The internal space of a typical Coppergate building was modest, approximately 4 to 5 meters wide, and perhaps 8 to 10 meters deep, with a central hearth for heating and cooking whose smoke escaped through a hole in the roof, or through the thatch itself. These buildings were not crude or primitive by the standards of their time and region. They represented the standard timber construction technology of Northern European building practice in the 9th and 10th centuries, practical, maintainable, and sufficiently insulating for the Yorkshire climate. But they were entirely organic structures, and their survival in the archaeological record is due entirely to the exceptional waterlogging conditions of the Coppergate site rather than any inherent durability. The plots on which these buildings stood were narrow and deep, approximately 5 meters wide at the street frontage, and extending perhaps 25 to 30 meters back from the street. This plot patterned the characteristic medieval burgage plot, long and thin, maximizing street frontage while extending back from the road, was established during the Viking period at Coppergate, and is visible in the property boundaries of the modern city. The property boundaries of York in the 21st century preserve, in their geometry, the plot divisions established by Viking settlers 1100 years ago. The buildings fronted directly onto the street, no setback, no forecourt. The street frontage was the commercial face of the building. The front room or a dedicated shop space served as the workshop and sales area, with residential space behind and above. Craft production and domestic life occupied the same building, frequently the same room, in an integration of work and home that is entirely foreign to modern urban experience. The great exception to the timber construction norm was the ecclesiastical architecture of the city. York Minster, or rather, its predecessor structures on the same site, represented the most significant stone construction in Viking Age York. The first church on the Minster site dated to 627 AD, and by 900 AD, the site had accumulated centuries of ecclesiastical building. The precise form of the building that stood on the Minster site in 900 AD is not fully documented, but it was a substantial stone structure of considerable religious and symbolic importance. The seat of the Archbishop of York, whose authority extended across the entire ecclesiastical province of the north of England. Chapter 5: Population and Social Structure. The population of Jorvik in 900 AD is estimated by historians at somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000 people, making it the second largest city in England after London, and one of the most significant urban centers in the British Isles. This figure represents a substantial increase over the Anglo-Saxon Jorvik that preceded it. The Viking period was, paradoxically, given its reputation for violence, a period of significant urban growth and commercial expansion for York. The Scandinavian newcomers brought with them trading connections that extended across the North Sea to Denmark, Norway, and the wider Viking world, and those connections drove the commercial activity that attracted population and sustained urban growth. The social composition of the city in 900 AD was complex and in active transition. At the political apex sat the Scandinavian kings of Jorvik in 900 AD. The city was in the period between the reign of Gufrith, who died in 895 AD, and the subsequent period of contested control that preceded the establishment of a new Scandinavian dynasty in the early 10th century. Below the royal level, a Scandinavian aristocracy of military leaders and major landowners exercised local power. The merchant class was particularly important in Jorvik's social structure, more prominent, arguably, than in many contemporary European cities, because the commercial function of the city was central to its identity and its prosperity in a way that reflected the Scandinavian cultural emphasis on trade and seafaring. Successful merchants in Viking York could accumulate significant wealth and social standing independent of aristocratic or ecclesiastical patronage. The existing Anglo-Saxon population did not disappear. They continued to live in and around the city, and the process of cultural integration between the Scandinavian newcomers and the indigenous population was already well underway by 900 AD. The Anglo-Scandinavian culture that emerged from this integration is documented in the archaeological record in the hybrid art styles that combine Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon decorative traditions, in the mixed linguistic evidence of the inscriptions and place names, and in the physical evidence of the Coppergate buildings themselves, where the material culture shows a blend of Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon elements. The church remained a significant institution in the city despite the Viking conquest. The Archbishopric of York continued to function. There is documentary evidence of archbishops in York throughout the Viking period, suggesting a working relationship between the Scandinavian rulers and the ecclesiastical establishment that the conquest had not destroyed. Chapter 6: Trade, Craft, and Economic Life. The economic life of Jorvik in 900 AD was the defining characteristic of the city, the activity that explained its population, its growth, and its significance within the wider world of Viking Age Northern Europe. The Coppergate excavations produced evidence of craft production of extraordinary range and sophistication. On a single excavated street block, archaeologists identified evidence for the working of wood, leather, iron, copper alloy, silver, gold, amber, jet, antler, bone, and textile. This concentration of craft activity in a small urban area reflects an economy in which specialization, the division of labor between different craft trades, was well established and commercially organized. The amber and jet working at Coppergate is particularly significant. Amber came to York from the Baltic coast, the southeastern shore of the Baltic Sea, where amber deposits are concentrated through Scandinavian trading networks. Jet came from Whitby on the Yorkshire coast, approximately 40 kilometers from York. Both materials were worked into jewelry and decorative objects at Coppergate, and the finished goods were distributed through the same trading networks that brought the raw materials to the city. The antler combs produced at Coppergate represent another well-documented Jorvik craft industry. Large quantities of antler comb fragments and production waste, the offcuts and failed pieces that result from comb manufacture, were recovered from the Coppergate deposits, indicating a workshop-scale production of the composite antler combs that were a standard personal grooming item throughout the Viking world. The antler used was red deer antler, sourced from the hunting grounds of the Yorkshire countryside, and the finished combs were objects of genuine quality and craftsmanship, the individual teeth cut with precision, the side plates decorated with incised geometric ornament. The River Ouse was the commercial artery of the city. Its navigable connection to the Humber estuary, and from there to the North Sea, gave Jorvik direct maritime access to the entire network of Viking Age trading routes to the Frisian ports of the continental coast, to the Scandinavian homelands, to the ports of the Irish Sea and the British North and West, and through the river systems of eastern England to the interior of the country. Material evidence for this long-distance trade is present throughout the Coppergate assemblage. Silk fragments, the most exotic textile in the Viking Age Western world, imported ultimately from Byzantium or the Islamic East through Scandinavian intermediary trading routes, were recovered from the waterlogged deposits. German Rhenish pottery appears in the assemblage alongside locally produced wares. Coins from multiple minting authorities, including coins from the continent and from various Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, document the monetary dimension of Jorvik's commercial activity. The city had its own mint in the Viking period, a significant marker of political and economic authority, since the right to mint coins was a royal prerogative, and the existence of a Jorvik mint confirms both the city's political status as a capital and its commercial sophistication as an economy where monetary exchange was sufficiently developed to require a local coin supply. Chapter 7: Religion, Culture, and Identity. The religious landscape of Jorvik in 900 AD was in a state of active transition, the consequence of the encounter between the Norse paganism of the Scandinavian settlers and the established Christianity of the Anglo-Saxon population they had conquered and were now living alongside. The Scandinavian settlers of the 9th century were not uniformly or completely pagan. Conversion to Christianity among Scandinavians was already underway in this period, driven by contact with Christian populations across the Viking world's extensive trading networks. The process of conversion in Jorvik appears to have been relatively rapid. By the early 10th century, there is evidence of Christian Scandinavian rulers in the city, and the coinage of the Viking kings of York includes Christian iconography alongside Norse symbolism. The physical evidence for religious life in Viking York is mixed. The Minster continued to function as an ecclesiastical center throughout the Viking period. The documentary record of the Archbishopric of York confirms continuity of Christian institutional life. At the same time, Norse religious symbolism appears in the decorative arts of the city. Scandinavian mythological imagery on metalwork, stone sculpture incorporating both Christian and Norse decorative traditions, and personal objects with religious associations reflecting the complex and fluid religious identity of a population in transition between two belief systems. The Coppergate excavations produced a carved wooden post decorated with interlaced animal ornament in the Scandinavian boar style, one of many objects from the site that document the vitality of Viking Age decorative art in the city. Stone sculpture from the Viking period survives in several York churches, including the remarkable collection at St. Mary Bishophill Jr. and the fragments preserved in York Minster itself. These sculptures blend Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian decorative traditions in ways that reflect the cultural synthesis underway in the city. The linguistic evidence for Viking York is preserved permanently in the English language. The concentration of Old Norse place names in Yorkshire, and specifically in York itself, is the densest in England, reflecting the intensity of Scandinavian settlement in the region. Words that entered English from Old Norse during this period include everyday vocabulary: sky, window, knife, husband, ugly, awkward, anger, take, want. Call. A linguistic legacy of the Viking presence in northern England that persists in the language spoken by millions of people today. Chapter 8: Defense and Political Power. The defensive architecture of Jorvik in 900 AD combined the inherited Roman infrastructure with Viking Age modifications and additions. The Roman walls remained the primary defensive perimeter of the city, their stone construction and substantial height providing a level of fortification that timber Viking Age construction could not readily replicate. The Viking rulers of Jorvik understood the military value of what they had inherited and maintained and repaired the walls accordingly. Archaeological investigation of the wall circuit has identified phases of Viking Age repair and modification, confirming that the walls were actively maintained as a functioning defensive system during the Scandinavian period. The River Ouse and the River Foss provided additional natural defenses on the western and eastern sides of the city, respectively. The peninsula of higher ground between the two rivers that had recommended the site to Roman military engineers in the 1st century AD was equally valuable to Viking defenders in the 9th and 10th centuries. The political structure of Viking Jorvik was that of a Scandinavian kingdom, with the king as the ultimate source of military and judicial authority. The kingdom of Jorvik at its greatest extent controlled much of what is now Yorkshire, and the North and East Midlands. A significant territorial entity whose capital city's wealth and commercial activity provided the economic foundation for royal power. The King's Hall, the primary residence of the Viking rulers, has not been definitively identified archaeologically, but its existence within the former Roman fortress precinct is the most probable location, consistent with the pattern of other Viking Age royal and aristocratic centers in the British Isles. The legal and administrative structures of the kingdom combine Scandinavian customary law with elements inherited from the Anglo-Saxon administration of the pre-conquest period. The Danelaw, the term used by historians for the areas of England under Scandinavian legal and political influence, was not a complete replacement of existing institutions, but a modification and overlay of them. And York functioned as the administrative as well as commercial and military center of this hybrid political entity. From Jorvik to York, the long transformation. The Viking kingdom of Jorvik came to an end in 954 AD, when Eric Bloodaxe, the last Viking king of York, was killed at the Battle of Stainmore in the Pennines. York reverted to Anglo-Saxon political control under the Northumbrian earls, and then, after the Norman conquest of 1066, to Norman French rule under William the Conqueror, who recognized the strategic importance of the city immediately and constructed 2 castles to control it. But the Viking century left marks on York that have never been erased. The street names remain: Goodramgate, Gillygate, Micklegate, Feesgate, Coppergate, Old Norse preserved in daily use, spoken by people who have no knowledge of its origin, a linguistic layer that the Norman conquest and every subsequent century of English history has failed to remove. The property boundaries remain. The narrow, deep burgage plots established by Viking settlers at Coppergate and elsewhere in the city in the 9th century define property ownership in central York to the present day. Their geometry unchanged across 1100 years of buying, selling, building, and rebuilding on the same ground. The Roman walls remain. The structure that the Vikings inherited, maintained, and modified is still the defining feature of York's urban form. The circuit of walls that makes York one of the best preserved walled cities in England is, at its foundation, the same circuit that Roman military engineers built in the 2nd century AD, and that Viking defenders repaired in the 9th. And the Coppergate excavations remain transformed into the Jorvik Viking Center, where the actual excavated ground of the Viking city is displayed beneath the reconstruction of the street as it appeared in 975 AD, the date chosen to represent the city at the height of its Viking Age development. The timbers of actual Viking buildings are preserved in the display. The objects found in the deposits, the combs, the shoes, the silk fragments, the amber jewelry, are in the collections of the Yorkshire Museum. York in 900 AD was a city of extraordinary complexity and vitality, a place where Roman military geometry contained a Norse trading economy, where Anglo-Saxon Christianity coexisted with Scandinavian cultural identity, where amber from the Baltic and silk from Byzantium were worked and traded on the same narrow street where Roman soldiers had once drilled 8 centuries before. It was, in the truest sense, a city of layers, and every layer is still there, beneath the medieval streets and the Georgian facades and the modern shopfronts of one of England's most visited historic cities. You just have to know where to look.